Previously, I explored the bracket system by making cEDH across all 5 different brackets, and today I wanted to do the same thing except using Frodo, Adventurous Hobbit, partnered with Sam, Loyal Attendant. I chose these two because in the previous episode I struggled to decide what an appropriate power level for bracket 2 was, but because these two are in a Precon together, the bracket 2 list is actually already really well defined. So let's start by discussing the commanders and the Precon list. Frodo has an ability where when he attacks, if you gain 3 or more life this turn, he tempts you. Then, if you've been tempted more than 2 times this game and Frodo is your ring bearer, you draw a card. This is a decent ability because every deck gets better with more card draw, and having a reliable, low-cost commander which draws you cards ensures you get that draw every game. Sam, on the other hand, creates foods and also makes activate abilities of your foods cheaper to activate, because using a food gains you 3 life, sacrificing a food fulfills the necessary life gain requirements for Frodo's ability. Like most Precon lists, this deck has a few different themes. This Precon is primarily about life gain and food, and additionally it has a minor low power matters theme. Wizards has gotten a lot better about making these Precons, and this deck runs both ramp as well as a lot of generically good removal, such as Swords to Plowshares and Anguished Unmaking. When you combine all that with the card draw that Frodo gives you, this deck actually ends up as a pretty strong list as far as Precons go. Now at the end of this video, I'll take this to a bracket 1, but I want to start by going up the brackets, and my plan to do that is to go all in on the food theme. In general, a great way to take a Precon deck to the bracket 3 level is to pick one of the themes of the Precon and focus the deck entirely on that. Simply choosing to focus primarily on the food theme will give me the kind of synergies and big plays we expect to see at the bracket 3 level. The first thing I'll upgrade is the mana base. The mana base is really important in this deck because you want all 3 of your colors in the first 3 turns of the game, and the current mana base makes that difficult because so many of the lands enter tapped and there aren't as many duels as we would like. Of course, I could start with the 3 shock lands, 3 fetches, and a Triome, but I'm going to stick to a budget at bracket 3 and run some of the cheaper duels instead. To make room for these, I'm going to cut these basic fetch lands because they're kind of slow, as well as some basics themselves. Lastly, I'm going to cut Rogue's Passage and Access Tunnel. The reason I'm doing this is because I played this deck recently and found I never wanted to use these lands because the first ability of the ring tempts you can effectively make your ring bearer unblockable anyways. So these lands were never useful, and the fact they only tap for colorless is a huge strike against them in this deck. The lands out of the way, the first 3 cards I will cut are Chromatic Lantern, Commander Sphere, and Pristine Talisman. Since we're running green and I want to play Sam on turn 3, I'm not very interested in 3 mana rocks, and we improved the mana base, so Chromatic Lantern and Commander Sphere aren't really necessary because our color fixing has gotten so much better. I'm also going to cut a lot of the weaker cards, most of which have nothing to do with the food theme or cost too much mana for what they do. To find cards to replace them with, I'm going to head over to Scryfall and search up every food card there is and start adding the ones that seem decent. So that's cards like Academy Manufacturer, Eleanor Gardener, Hazel's Brewmaster, Peregrine Took, Samwise Gamgee, and even Sir Ginger, the Meal Ender. I'd love to even add in some of these bad food cards like Bacon to Pie, because that's hilarious, but I can't really justify putting a 4 mana kill spell in a bracket 3 deck. That would be more of a bracket 1 food strategy in my opinion. Now there are some powerful cards I'll cut as well, most notably Woodfall Primus, Toxic Deluge, and Essence Warden. I'm cutting Woodfall because I don't have a reliable sack outlet for it, and even if I did, that could just mean a really mean combo where I end up destroying people's lands, which I'd rather not do. Toxic Deluge is getting cut because the Battle of Bywater is much more thematic and synergistic because it typically isn't going to blow up my own creatures. And with Essence Warden, I'd rather just make room for more food related cards and gain life that way. I'll also change up the ramp. Cultivate and Farseek will get dropped because they're not related to the deck's food theme, and also they're 2 and 3 mana, which isn't ideal since those are the turns I want to be casting my commanders. Instead, I'll use the Ring Goes South and Knight of the Sweet's Revenge, which can be played on curve after both of my commanders come out. I'm also going to add in Jaheira because she's going to turn my foods into mana rocks, and it's okay that she's 3 mana because I'm not going to be playing her until later in the game once I have a couple foods anyways. I've also added in a lot of weaker food cards still, like Heaped Harvest, Lembas, and Candy Trail. These cards aren't particularly good, but whenever I build this style of deck, I try to go all in on the mechanic from the beginning just to see if I can make it work and get a ton of value and synergy from everything. If it doesn't work, I can remove these cards and replace them with generically good cards, but I'm not going to start out with those generically good cards. That also means replacing some cards like Harmonize with something like Bristlebud Farmer, which is mechanically on theme and also gives me card advantage. Lastly, I'm going to add in Cauldron Familiar and Witch's Oven. I'm used to seeing these as part of 60 card combos, but I think in this deck's current form, there aren't any infinite combos, and we'll just be playing these for value. Also, I should mention I added an Agent of the Iron Throne. This card should be really strong in this deck since the ability will apply to both Frodo and Sam, so each time I sacrifice a food, each of my opponents will lose 2 life. Technically, I could have added in the game changers and upped the power level of this deck even at bracket 3, but as one of my viewers pointed out in the last video, just because I can doesn't mean I should. The goal of the bracket system isn't to try to make the most powerful deck you're technically allowed to, it's just meant to help guide deck building, and in this case, based on my experience played with randos at card shops, this deck would do very well against the average bracket 3 deck, but wouldn't play a bunch of unfair cards like Gaia's Cradle or the One Ring that could make it almost unstoppable. More importantly, this kind of deck is always going to feel fun and fair to my opponents because food just isn't thought of as a busted mechanic, so even if I pop off with this deck and end up with 20 mana or hitting someone for lethal commander using the field-tested frying pan, I think people will be more amused rather than upset. For bracket 4, I'm just going to drop many of the weaker and more thematic cards I mentioned and try to set this deck up to have a ton of different combos largely related to food tokens. Like before, I'll start by upgrading the mana base and getting rid of most of the enters tapped lands and instead add in fetches and shocks. I'm also going to cut the land count down to 32 because I'll be adding in a lot more mana dorks, mana rocks, and also generally lowering the mana curve of the deck. At bracket 4, it's important to much more critically examine the mana cost of our cards, so I'm going to drop Well of Lost Dreams, Genesis Storm, Treebeard, Motivated Farmer, and some other 4 or more mana cost cards. I also want some more powerful win cons, so right away that's going to mean Marionette Master and Marionette Apprentice on top of all the combos this deck has. Honestly, I can't even keep track of all the combos this deck is running, and in fact, it's probably the kind of deck you'd have to play a dozen times to even find them all. I'm also going to jam in a bunch of the game changers. The fact is game changers are powerful cards, and simply adding cards in like Demonic Tutor, the One Ring, Teferi's Protection, Smothering Tithe, and Gaia's Cradle will be a huge boost to the overall power level of this deck. We're also going to add in sack outlets like Warren Soul Trader and Viscera Seer, which enable a bunch of different combos, such as with Chatterfang to generate a bunch of treasures, or enable infinite combos with Cauldron Familiar and either Academy Manufacturer or Peregrine Took, or even using Sam plus Academy Manufacturer and Experimental Confectioneer. There are probably others as well, but again, there's just too many combo lines in this deck, and more than I probably would even know without playing dozens of games with it. Of course, some of the combos do require specific pieces, so on top of Demonic Tutor, I'm running other tutors like Enlightened Tutor, Eldrami's Call, and Finale of Devastation. Enlightened Tutor is useful for grabbing a lot of combo pieces such as the token doublers, as well as cards like Clock of Omens, Witch's Oven, and Academy Manufacturer, which combine combo out for the win. But even just using it to grab the One Ring or Smothering Tithe is also great. Overall, this deck is still maintaining the food theme and a lot of the win cons from the bracket 3 version, but now it's able to tutor up game-ending combos and is just additionally running the most busted cards in EDH. Now, taking this to cEDH is a bit tricky because these commanders aren't really considered part of the cEDH meta, but we can still build this deck out in a way that makes it appropriate for a cEDH tournament. As with previous brackets, we'll start by updating the lands, which mostly means adding in the revised duels and cutting a few of them. Then we'll jam in all the remaining tutors and fast mana effects and remove some of the less efficient combos and add in some cEDH staples such as Ad Nauseam. In cEDH, I like stacks effects, so I'm going to add in some of those as well, such as Boromir and Grand Abolisher, and also Silence. Lastly, on the advice of my intern, I'm going to add in the Devoted Druid and Hazel combo so I can generate infinite mana and kill people with Walking Ballista. So now this deck is similar to the bracket 4 deck, except it's designed specifically for a cEDH metagame And the point of the deck is to just try to combo off as fast as possible while also preventing your opponents from comboing off. This is a bit different than bracket 4 EDH, where although the deck has ways to tutor up early game combos, it's still designed for the kind of big value plays you see in normal EDH. Now, it's time to finally get to bracket 1. Bracket 1 is meant to be ultra casual and value theme over function. And I see a lot of people online who think valuing theme means you don't have to have a functional deck, and I don't personally accept that. Bracket 1, in my view, is not an excuse to make a deck which effectively doesn't do anything. So for my Frodo Sam list, I'm gonna go all in on the Lord of the Rings theme and start by removing the cards which aren't thematic or clash with my commanders. For example, Mirkwood Bats, the flavor text is from when Gandalf is in Bilbo's house, and it doesn't really make sense to me that these evil bats would be on the same team as Frodo and Sam, so it gets cut. Additionally, even though Golem Obsessed Stalker is a strong card, he's not really on the same team as Sam and Frodo when he's obsessively stalking them, so instead I'm going to replace him with Smeagol, Helpful Guide. I'm also going to cut cards like Cultivate, Path to Exile, and Source Plowshares because they're just reskins of existing cards and the flavor doesn't speak to me the way the flavor of other cards does. This isn't to say I'll remove all the reskin cards. For example, Anguish Unmaking will stay because this card can exile the One Ring, and the flavor text speaks to when the One Ring is destroyed in the fires of Mount Doom. I want to be able to make plays like that with this deck, both because if I play against other Lord of the Rings themed decks, it would be epic to get to exile the One Ring, and also because it's hilarious to imagine throwing someone's Soul Ring into the fires of Mount Doom. And that's really what this deck is about, being able to play cards that speak to the epicness of Lord of the Rings. So of course I'm going to add in cards like Eagle of Deliverance and Gandalf White Rider, as well as some more Ents, because not only are they thematically big plays, but mechanically they can actually impact the game state. I also want to add in cool combat tricks like Cannot Pass, Stew the Conies, and Slip on the Ring. These are going to allow for epic plays as well, because maybe someone will swing at me with their Balrog, and then I'll block and cast You Cannot Pass to kill it. But even if I'm not playing against another Lord of the Rings deck, if someone swings at me with some other random big creature, it's still hilariously epic to use this to blow up a Kozilek or Madrotha or Ur-Dragon or whatever. Same is true for a card like Stew the Connies. Ideally, I would cast this to make Sam kill another player's golem, but even if that doesn't happen, it would be hilarious to use a giant Treebeard to bash someone's Kozilek in the head with a frying pan. Some of the cards I put in this deck, like Mithril Coat, are very strong, but it's important to remember bracket 1 doesn't mean you have to play a random pile of cards. In fact, bracket 1 shouldn't just be a pile of random cards that are tied together by something like the facial hair art. It should be the case that whatever theme you pursue still enables viable plays. So while this deck is only slightly worse than the bracket 2 Precon version of it, I think that's perfectly fine because we're not obligated to make bracket 1 decks virtually unplayable. Unless that is you're also going to be playing against other people who are running decks which basically don't do anything. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.